A meeting with Medusa. 1. A day to remember. The Queen Elizabeth was over 3 miles above the Grand Canyon, dawdling along at a comfortable 180, when Howard Falcon spotted the camera platform closing in from the right. He had been expecting it, but was not too happy to have company. He was the first man in history to navigate a ship 3/10 of a mile long. So far, the test flight had gone perfectly. Commander Falcon handed over to his second officer and walked out into the transparent tubeway that led through the heart of the ship. Overwhelmed as always by the spectacle of the largest single space ever enclosed by man. The 10 spherical gas cells, each more than 100 feet across, were ranged one behind the other like a line of gigantic soap bubbles. So clear he could see through the whole length of the array, often reminding him of a squadron of harmless jellyfish, pulsing their mindless way above a shallow tropical reef. He rode up to the observation deck, where workmen and superchimp assistants were laying the partly completed dance floor. The simps flashed toothy smiles as he walked through to the Sky Lounge, his favorite place in the ship. With the unbroken silver sweep of the envelope below, and out to the horizon, the fantastic wilderness carved by the Colorado River. Falcon's pocket communicator beeped. The co-pilot was calling from the bridge. "Au for rendezvous, Captain? We've got all the data we need from this run, and the TV people are getting impatient." Falcon glanced at the camera platform, now matching his speed 1/10 of a mile away. "Ok," he replied. "Proceed as arranged. I'll watch from here." He walked back through the observation deck for a better view amidships, and let himself out onto the small external platform flaring from the end of the deck. The covers of the forward cargo hatch had already opened like giant trapdoors, and the camera platform was hovering above them, preparing to descend. A sudden gust of crosswinds slapped Falcon's cheek, and he tightened his grip on the guardrail. The Grand Canyon was a bad place for turbulence. Without any real anxiety, he focused his attention on the descending platform, now about 150 feet above the ship. He knew the skilled operator had performed this maneuver a dozen times already, yet he seemed to be reacting sluggishly. That last gust had drifted the platform almost to the edge of the open hatchway. Surely the pilot would have corrected before this. There he went again, off to the left. Could the pilot be drunk? Improbable though that seemed, Falcon reached for his microphone switch. Once again, without warning, he was slapped violently in the face. He barely felt it, for he was staring in horror at the camera platform. The operator was fighting for control, trying to balance the craft on its tail, but he was only making matters worse. The oscillations increased by degrees. 40, 60, 90. "Switch to automatic, you fool," Falcon shouted uselessly into his microphone. "Your manual control's not working." The platform flipped over on its back. The jets no longer supported it, but pushed it swiftly downward. They had suddenly become allies of the gravity they had fought until this moment. Falcon never heard the crash, though he felt it. He was already racing for the elevator that would take him down to the bridge. It would be many months before he knew the answer to that question. Just as he was stepping into the elevator cage, he changed his mind. If there was a power failure, better be on the safe side. He began to run down the spiral stairway circling the shaft. Halfway down, he paused to inspect the damage. That damned platform had gone clear through the ship, rupturing 2 of the gas cells. They were still collapsing slowly, in great falling veils of plastic. He was not worried about the loss of lift. Far more serious was the possibility of structural damage. The great latticework around him was groaning and protesting under its abnormal loads. He was just resuming his descent when a super chimp, shrieking with fright, came racing down the elevator shaft, hand over hand along the outside of the latticework. In its terror, the poor simp had torn off its company uniform, perhaps in an unconscious attempt to regain the freedom of its ancestors. Falcon, still descending as swiftly as he could, watched its approach with alarm. A distraught simp was a powerful and potentially dangerous animal. As it overtook him, it called out a string of words, jumbled together, save one plaintive, frequently repeated, "Boss-ite." He felt sorry for the creature, involved in a man-made disaster beyond its comprehension. It stopped opposite him, on the other side of the lattice, its face only inches from his, and he was looking straight into the terrified eyes. He felt that strange mingling of kinship and discomfort that all men experience when they gaze thus into the mirror of time. His presence seemed to have calmed the creature. Falcon pointed up the shaft, back toward the observation deck, and said very clearly and precisely, "Boss, go." "Yeah. Chasa." To his relief, the simp understood. It gave him a grimace that might have been a smile, and at once started to race back the way it had come. Falcon had given it the best advice he could. If any safety remained aboard the Queen, it was in that direction, but his duty lay in the other. He had almost completed his descent when, with a sound of rending metal, the vessel pitched nose down, and the lights went out. But he could still see, for a shaft of sunlight streamed through the open hatch and the huge tear in the envelope. Many years ago, he had stood in a great cathedral watching light pouring through stained glass windows onto ancient flagstones. The dazzling shaft through the ruined fabric high above reminded him of that moment. He was in a cathedral of metal, falling down the sky. When he reached the bridge, he was horrified to see how close the ship was to the ground. Only 3,000 feet below were the beautiful and deadly pinnacles of rock. And there was no level area anywhere in sight where a ship as large as the Queen could come to rest on an even keel. A glance at the display board told him that all the ballast had gone. However, the rate of descent had been reduced to a few yards a second. They still had a fighting chance. Without a word, Falcon eased himself into the pilot's seat and took over such control as still remained. One of the most spectacular wrecks in history was occurring without a single camera to record it. The last moments of the Queen would never fill millions with awe and terror, as had those of the Hindenburg, a century and a half before. Now the ground was only about 1,700 feet away. Though he had full thrust, he had not dared to use it, lest the weakened structure collapse, but now he had no choice. The wind was taking them toward a fork in the canyon, where the river was split by a wedge of rock like the prow of some gigantic, fossilized ship of stone. If she continued on her present course, the Queen would straddle that plateau and come to rest with a third of her length jutting out over nothingness. She would snap like a rotten stick. Falcon opened up the lateral thrusters. The ship staggered and began to slew to port. The shriek of tearing metal was now almost continuous. A glance at the damage control board showed that cell number 5 had just gone. The ground was only yards away. He switched the thrust vectors over to vertical, giving maximum lift to reduce the force of impact. The crash seemed to last forever. It was not violent, merely prolonged and irresistible, as if the whole universe were falling about them. The sound of crunching metal came nearer, as if some great beast were eating its way through the dying ship. Then the floor and ceiling closed upon him like a vice. 2. Because it's there. Why do you want to go to Jupiter? As Springer said when he lifted for Pluto, because it's there. Thanks. Now we've got that out of the way. Tell me the real reason. Howard Falcon smiled, though only those who knew him well could have interpreted the slight, leathery grimace. Webster was one of them. For more than 20 years they had been involved in each other's projects, sharing triumphs and disasters, including the greatest disaster of all. Well, Springer's cliché is still valid. We've landed on all the terrestrial planets, but none of the gas giants. They are the only real challenge left in the solar system. An expensive one. Have you worked out the cost? As well as I can. Here are the estimates. Remember though, this isn't a one-shot mission, but a transportation system. Once it's proved out, it can be used over and over again. And it will open up not merely Jupiter, but all the giants. Webster looked at the figures and whistled. Why not start with an easier planet? Uranus, for example. Half the gravity and less than half the escape velocity. There's very little saving when you allow for the extra distance. For Jupiter, we can use the facilities of Ganymede. Beyond Saturn, we'd have to establish a new supply base. Logical, thought Webster, but Jupiter was lord of the solar system, and Falcon would be interested in no lesser challenge. Besides, Falcon continued, Jupiter is a major scientific scandal. It's more than 100 years since its radio storms were discovered, but we still don't know what causes them. And the Great Red Spot is as big a mystery as ever. Do you know how many probes they have dropped into that atmosphere? Couple of hundred, I believe. 326 over the last 50 years, a quarter of them total failures. They've learned a lot, but barely scratched the planet. Do you realize how big it is? None. More than 10 times the size of Earth. Yes, but do you know what that really means? Falcon pointed to the large globe in the corner of Webster's office. Look at India, how small it seems. Well, if you skinned Earth and spread it out on the surface of Jupiter, it would look about as big as India does here. There was a long silence while Webster contemplated the equation. Jupiter is to Earth as Earth is to India. Falcon had deliberately, of course, chosen the best possible example. 10 years ago, Falcon had invited him to a preview, a 3-day drift across the northern plains of India. Perfectly safe. He had promised, and Webster had not been disappointed. Next to his first journey to the moon, it had been the most memorable experience of his life. Converting him to lighter-than-air flight and teaching him the enormous size of India. Jupiter is to Earth as Earth is to India. Granting your argument, he said, and supposing the funds are available, there's another question. Why should you do better than the... What is it? 326 robot probes that have already made the trip. I am better qualified than they were, as an observer and as a pilot. Especially as a pilot. Don't forget, I've more experience of lighter-than-air travel than anyone in the world. I've been not sure. You could still serve as controller and sit safely on Ganymede. Yes. That's just the point. They've already done that. Don't you remember what killed the Queen? EC. Webster knew perfectly well, but he merely answered, Go on. Time lag. That idiot of a platform controller thought he was using a local radio circuit. But he'd been accidentally switched through a satellite, half a second of lag for the round trip. It wouldn't have mattered in calm air. It was the turbulence over the Grand Canyon that did it. When the platform tipped, and he corrected for that, it had already tipped the other way. Ever tried to drive a car over a bumpy road with a half-second delay in the steering? No, and I don't intend to try, but I can imagine it. Well, Ganymede is 1,000,000 kilometers from Jupiter, a round-trip delay of 6 seconds. You need a controller on the spot to handle emergencies in real time. Let me show you something. Mind if I use this? Go ahead. Falcon picked up a postcard lying on Webster's desk and held it dangling vertically. Place your thumb and finger on either side, not quite touching. Now catch it. End. Falcon waited then, without warning, let go. Webster's thumb and finger closed on empty air. No, you try it on me. Ethel. This time, Webster grasped the card and dropped it without warning. It had scarcely moved before Falcon caught it. When they put me together again, Falcon remarked in an expressionless voice, the surgeons made some improvements. This is one of them, and there are others. I want to make the most of them. Jupiter is the place where I can do it. Pota. Webster stared for long seconds at the fallen card. Then he said quietly, I understand. How long do you think it will take? With your help, plus the Bureau, plus all the science foundations we can drag in. 3 years. Then a year for trials. We'll have to send in at least 2 test models. So with luck, 5 years. That's about what I thought. I hope you get your luck. You've earned it. But there's one thing I won't do. What's that? Next time you go ballooning, don't expect me as passenger. 3. The world of the gods. The fall from Jupiter Free to Jupiter itself takes only 3.5 hours. Sleep was a weakness that Howard Falcon hated, and the little he still required brought dreams that time had not yet been able to exorcise. But he could expect no rest in the 3 days ahead, and must seize what he could during the long fall down into that ocean of clouds, some 60,000 miles below. As soon as Kon-Tiki had entered her transfer orbit, he prepared for the last sleep he might ever know. Closing down for 2 hours, he reported to the mothership. Falcon switched on the sleep inducer, and consciousness faded swiftly. He slept without dreams. They always came when he awoke, brought with him from Earth. Yet he never dreamed of the crash itself, though he often found himself again face to face with that terrified super-chimp, descending the spiral stairway between the collapsing gas bags. None of the simps had survived. Those not killed outright had been painlessly youthed. He sometimes wondered why he dreamed only of this doomed creature, and not of the friends and colleagues he had lost aboard the dying queen. The dreams he feared most began with his first return to consciousness. There had been no sensation of any kind. He was in darkness and silence, and did not even seem to be breathing. Strangest of all, he could not locate his limbs, because he did not know where they were. One by one his senses had returned, and pain had come with them. He had had to learn everything anew, recapitulating infancy and babyhood. 100 times he had envied that dead super-chimp, but he had been given no choice. The doctors had made their decision, and now, 12 years later, he was where no human being had ever traveled before, moving faster than any man in history, Kon-Tiki was just emerging from shadow, and the Jovian dawn bridged the sky ahead in a titanic bow of light when the alarm dragged Falcon up from sleep. The greatest and perhaps last adventure of his life was before him. He called Mission Control to report that everything was in order. His velocity had just passed 31 miles a second, and in half an hour Kon-Tiki would hit the outer fringes of the atmosphere, starting the most difficult re-entry in the entire solar system. Peaks of 30 Gs, averaging more than 10. Falcon attached the elaborate restraints that would anchor him to the cabin walls until he was virtually part of the ship's structure. The clock was counting backward, 100 seconds to re-entry. From beyond the walls of the capsule came a ghostly sighing, rising steadily to a high-pitched, screaming roar, transformed a couple of octaves upward by the thin hydrogen-helium atmosphere. With the rising scream came mounting weight. Within seconds he was completely immobilized. His field of vision contracted until it embraced only the clock and the accelerometer. 15 G, and 480 seconds to go. He never lost consciousness. Then the drag began to taper off. 10 G, 5 G, 2, and weight vanished almost completely. He was falling free, all his enormous orbital velocity destroyed. There was a sudden jolt as the incandescent remnants of the heat shield were jettisoned. He released all but 2 of the restraining buckles and waited for the next, most critical series of events. He did not see the first drog parachute pop out, but felt the slight jerk as the rate of fall diminished. There went the second drog. He looked up and saw, to his immense relief, clouds of glittering foil billowing out behind the falling ship. Like a great flower unfurling, the balloon spread out across the sky, scooping up the thin gas until it was fully inflated. And Kon-Tiki's rate of fall dropped to a few miles an hour and remained constant. With its characteristic and disconcerting crack, the fusion reactor started up, pouring heat into the envelope overhead, and the ship began to level. After traveling over 300 million miles, Kon-Tiki had at last begun to justify her name. An aerial raft, adrift upon the currents of the Jovian atmosphere. It was more than an hour before Falcon, having checked the capsule systems and adjusted the balloon cables, could examine the view. Mere speed was unimportant. The real danger was turbulence. Only then did Falcon pay attention to Mission Control's pleadings and deploy the instrument booms. And now at last he could look around. His first impression was disappointing. He might have been ballooning over an ordinary cloudscape on Earth. Then he looked at the infrared radar and knew how badly his eyes had been deceived. That layer of clouds, apparently 3 miles away, was really more than 37 miles below. The horizon, guessed at 125 miles, was actually 1,800 miles distant. It disturbed him profoundly. He did not feel that Jupiter was huge, but that he had shrunk to 1/10 of his normal size. And as he stared toward that unbelievably distant horizon, he felt as if a wind colder than the atmosphere around him was blowing through his soul. Despite all his arguments, this might never be a place for man. 65 miles farther down it would be as warm as equatorial Earth. Ideal conditions for life. Kon-Tiki had come down in the least colorful part of the planet. The sea of clouds stretching to the horizon was tinted a pale salmon. The great red spot, most spectacular of all the planet's features, lay thousands of miles to the south, that would have to wait for future expeditions. Falcon had agreed with one unusually modest researcher who had told him bluntly, "There are no experts on Jupiter." Well, there would be at least one by the end of this day. If he managed to survive until then. 4. The voices of the deep. That first day, the Father of the Gods smiled upon him. It was as calm and peaceful here as it had been years ago, drifting with Webster across the plains of northern India. Falcon had time to master his new skills, until Kon-Tiki seemed an extension of his own body. Such luck was more than he had dared hope for, and he began to wonder what price he might have to pay for it. The 5 hours of daylight were almost over. Color was swiftly draining from the sky except in the west, where a band of deepening purple lay along the horizon. With a speed perceptible to the eye, the sun went straight down over the edge of Jupiter. The stars came out in their legions, and there was the beautiful evening star of Earth, reminding him how far he was from home. Man's first night on Jupiter had begun. With the onset of darkness, Kon-Tiki started to sink as the balloon lost the feeble sunlight's heat. Falcon did nothing to increase lift. He had expected this, and was planning to descend. The cloud deck below showed a vast array of complex carbon compounds on the infrared radar, as well as hydrogen, helium, and ammonia. Half the basic molecules of life were here. And where there was food, could life be far away? An hour after sunset, he dropped his first probe, which fell swiftly, then began to float in the denser atmosphere, sending back torrents of radio signals. Just before midnight, a woman controller came on watch. 10 minutes later she called again, her voice at once serious and excited. "Howard, listen in on channel 46, high gain." He was plugged into the microphone on the probe, floating more than 80 miles below him in an atmosphere now almost as dense as water. At first there was only a soft hiss. Then, out of the background noise, there slowly emerged a booming vibration that grew louder and louder, like the beating of a gigantic drum. Felt as much as heard, the beats increasing their tempo, though the pitch never changed. Then suddenly, in mid-vibration, it stopped so abruptly that the mind could not accept the silence. It was the most extraordinary sound Falcon had ever heard. He could think of no natural phenomenon that could have caused it, nor was it like the cry of any animal, not even one of the great whales. It came again, following exactly the same pattern. From first faint throb to final crescendo, it lasted just over 10 seconds. And this time, there was a real echo, faint and far away. Mission Control asked him to drop another probe so as to locate the sources, a cluster about 1,200 miles away. For the obvious assumption that living creatures were responsible, the exobiologist quickly ruled that out. "I'll be very disappointed," said Dr. Brenner, "if there are no microorganisms or plants there. But nothing like animals, because there's no free oxygen. All biochemical reactions on Jupiter must be low-energy ones, and some of those sound waves are 100 yards long. Even an animal as big as a whale couldn't produce them. They must have a natural origin." Ah. About an hour before sunrise, the voices of the deep died away, and Falcon began preparing for the dawn of his second day. "We've some good news for you," Mission Control reported. Soon after dawn, the cloud layer's breaking up. You'll have partial clearing in an hour, but watch out for turbulence. "I've already noticed some," Falcon answered. "How far down will I be able to see?" "At least 12 miles down to the second thermocline. That cloud deck is solid. It never breaks." 10 minutes later, he could see it. A change in color near the horizon, the cloud layer ragged and lumpy, as if something had torn it open. He gave Kon-Tiki more altitude for a better view. The sky below was clearing rapidly, as if something was dissolving the solid overcast, and a moment later he sailed out over the edge of a cloud canyon about 12 miles deep and 600 miles wide. A new world lay spread beneath him. The second layer of clouds, unattainably far below, was much darker than the first, almost salmon pink, mottled with little oval islands of brick red. He reduced buoyancy, and Kon-Tiki began to drop down the face of the dissolving cliff. Then he noticed the snow, white flakes drifting slowly downward, much too warm for real snow, with no glitter or sparkle. When a few landed on an instrument boom, he saw they were dull, opaque white, several inches across, wax, some chemical reaction condensing the hydrocarbons out of the Jovian air. About 60 miles ahead, the little red ovals were being jostled around, beginning to form a spiral. Then his concern changed to wonder and to fear. What was developing in his line of flight was not a storm at all. Something enormous, scores of miles across, was rising through the clouds, shouldering its way through the pink and salmon overcast like an iceberg rising from the deeps. Focusing the telescope, Falcon saw a whitish, crystalline mass threaded with streaks of red and brown, the same stuff as the snowflakes, a mountain range of wax. And it was not, he realized, as solid as he had thought. Around the edges it was continually crumbling and reforming. "I know what it is." He radioed mission control. "It's a mass of bubbles, some kind of foam, hydrocarbon froth. Get the chemists working on. Just a minute. What is it?" Called mission control. "What is it?" He ignored the frantic pleas, had to be sure. If he made a mistake, he would be the laughingstock of the solar system. Then he relaxed, glanced at the clock, and switched off the nagging voice from Jupiter V8. "Hello, mission control," he said, very formally. "This is Howard Falcon aboard Kon-Tiki Gutaitin. Estimated time 19 hours 21 minutes 15 seconds. Latitude 0 degrees 5 minutes north. Longitude 105 degrees 42 minutes. System 1. Tell Dr. Brenner that there is life on Jupiter, and it's big. 5. The Wheels of Poseidon. I'm very happy to be proved wrong." Dr. Brenner radioed back cheerfully. "Nature always has something up her sleeve. Keep the long focus camera on target and give us the steadiest pictures you can." The things moving up and down those waxen slopes were still too far away for Falcon to make out many details, though they must have been very large to be visible at all at such a distance. Almost black, shaped like arrowheads, maneuvering by slow undulations of their entire bodies, like giant manta rays swimming above some tropical reef. Perhaps they were sky-born cattle, browsing on the cloud pastures of Jupiter. "No," said Falcon, answering mission control's repeated questions about the mantas. "They're still showing no reaction to me. I don't think they're intelligent. They look like harmless vegetarians." Yet he was disappointed when the mantas showed not the slightest interest in him. Huge black deltas, rippling over hills and valleys, little more substantial than the clouds of Earth. They were almost 100 yards across the wings, 3 times the length of the largest whale. The short day had almost gone when he passed over the crest of the waxen hills, the foam here sculptured into long, level terraces, like the interior of a lunar crater. On the lowest of those steps was a roughly oval mass, 1 or 2 miles across, a forest of pallid trees, Falcon thought, like giant mushrooms that had never seen the sun. Hundreds of thin trunks packed astonishingly close together. Perhaps it was a single enormous tree, like one of the giant banyans of the East, 10 times the size of the largest ever recorded on Earth. The light had almost gone. In the last light of his second day, Falcon saw, or thought he saw, something that cast the gravest doubts on his interpretation. Unless the dim light had deceived him, those hundreds of thin trunks were beating back and forth, in perfect synchronism, like fronds of kelp rocking in the surge. And the tree was no longer in the place where he had first seen it. "Sorry about this," said Mission Control, soon after sunset. "But we think source Beta is going to blow within the next hour. Probability 70%. Beta was well below his horizon, too far for the shockwave itself to be a serious danger. The radio storm it would trigger was another matter, when the gas from such eruptions reached the Jovian ionosphere. An electrical discharge millions of times more powerful than any terrestrial lightning sent a colossal thunderclap of radio noise flooding across the solar system. Probability 90%, said Mission Control with a note of urgency. "And forget that hour. Ganymede says it may be any moment." The reading on the magnetic field strength meter shot upward, then reversed and dropped as rapidly. Something had given the planet's molten core a titanic jolt. "There she blows," called Mission Control. "Thanks, I already know. When will the storm hit me?" "You can expect onset in 5 minutes. Peak in 10. Falcon retracted the instrument booms. There were no other precautions he could take. The noise level on the radio monitor slowly crept upward. Then a flicker as a far-off heat lightning danced along the eastern horizon. Simultaneously, half the circuit breakers jumped out, the lights failed, and all communications went dead. He tried to move, but was completely unable to. The paralysis gripping him was not merely psychological. A painful tingling over his entire body, the unmistakable crackle of a brush discharge. With a series of sharp bangs, the emergency systems reset, the lights flickered on again, and the paralysis disappeared as swiftly as it had come. There was no need to switch on the inspection lamps. The cables supporting the capsule seemed to be on fire. Lines of electric blue light stretching upward to the equator of the giant balloon, dazzling balls of fire rolling slowly along them. So strange and beautiful it was hard to read any menace in it. Falcon remembered the flaming death of the Hindenburg, destroyed by a stray spark at Lakehurst in 1937, but that could not happen here. Though there was more hydrogen above his head than had ever filled the last of the Zeppelins. "Hello, Kontiki. Are you receiving? Are you receiving?" "I receive you," he said. "Quite an electrical display, but no damage so far." The ball lightning disappeared first, the fiery globes expanding until they vanished in a gentle explosion. Faint glows remained around the exposed metal for an hour, and the radio stayed noisy until well after midnight. The remaining hours were uneventful, until just before dawn, when a glow appeared along the eastern horizon and moved toward him. A narrow, sharply defined band. Like the beam of an enormous searchlight swinging beneath the clouds. 60 miles behind the first came another and another, until the whole sky flickered with alternating sheets of light and darkness. It was so astonishing and inexplicable that he felt cold, naked fear gnawing at his self-control. No man could look upon such a sight without feeling like a helpless pygmy in the presence of forces beyond his comprehension. Was it possible that Jupiter carried not only life, but intelligence? "Yes, we see it," said Mission Control, in a voice that echoed his own awe. "We've no idea what it is. Stand by. We're calling Ganymede." The display slowly faded. In 5 minutes, it was all over. He had never before been so glad to hear the voice of Mission Control as when Dr. Brenner finally came on the circuit. "Hello, Kon-Tiki. We've solved your problem, but we can still hardly believe it. What you've been seeing is bioluminescence, very similar to that produced by microorganisms in the tropical seas of Earth. Here they're in the atmosphere, not the ocean, but the principle is the same. But the pattern," protested Falcon, "was so regular, so artificial, and it was hundreds of miles across. It was even larger than you imagine, over 3,000 miles wide, and looked like a revolving wheel. You merely saw the spokes, sweeping past you at about 0.6 of a mile a second." "A second?" Falcon interjected. "No animals could move that fast." "Of course not. What you saw was triggered by the shock wave from source beta, moving at the speed of sound. It's rare, but identical wheels of light, 1,000 times smaller, have been observed in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean for centuries. The wheels of Poseidon. The result of submarine earthquakes in shallow waters where the waves reflect into standing patterns. No wonder sailors used to be superstitious." That was it, Falcon told himself. When source beta blew, it must have sent shock waves through the compressed gas of the lower atmosphere and through the solid body of Jupiter. Canceling here, reinforcing there, until the whole planet rang like a bell. Yet the explanation did not destroy the sense of wonder. He would never forget those flickering bands of light, racing through unattainable depths of the Jovian atmosphere. He felt he was not only on a strange planet, but in some magical realm between myth and reality. And he still had a whole day to go. 6. Medusa. When the true dawn finally arrived, it brought a sudden change of weather. Kon-Tiki was moving through a blizzard. Waxen snowflakes fell so thickly that visibility was reduced to 0. Falcon worried about the weight accumulating on the envelope, but the flakes settling outside the windows quickly disappeared, evaporated by Kon-Tiki's continual outpouring of heat. He switched on the horizontal radar, until now useless. Then he had another surprise. Scattered across the sky ahead were dozens of large, brilliant echoes, isolated from one another, hanging unsupported in space. Clouds stuffed with rocks, as the earliest aviators used to say. Then a violent crosswind grabbed Kon-Tiki and swept it almost at right angles to its previous track. Falcon needed all his skill to prevent the ungainly vehicle from capsizing. Within minutes he was racing northward at over 300 miles an hour. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the turbulence ceased. The snowstorm dissolved, and he saw what Jupiter had been preparing for him. Kon-Tiki had entered the funnel of a gigantic whirlpool, some 600 miles across, swept along a curving wall of cloud. Overhead the sun shone in a clear sky, but far beneath, this great hole in the atmosphere drilled down to unknown depths where lightning flickered almost continuously. Falcon held Kon-Tiki at a constant altitude. The nearest echo was now only about 25 miles away, caught in the whirlpool like Kon-Tiki itself. He aimed the telescope along the radar bearing and found himself looking at a curious mottled cloud. Not until he had been staring for several minutes did Falcon realize he had met it once before, crawling across the drifting mountains of foam, mistaken for a giant, many-trunked tree. It did not resemble a tree at all, but a jellyfish, a Medusa, such as might be met trailing its tentacles along the warm eddies of the Gulf Stream. This Medusa was more than a mile across, its scores of dangling tentacles, hundreds of feet long, swaying slowly back and forth in perfect unison, as if the creature were clumsily rowing itself through the sky. The other echoes were more distant Medusae of the same species, drifting lazily around this 600-mile orbit. "You realize, Howard," said Dr. Brenner, when he had recovered from his initial astonishment, "that this thing is about 100,000 times as large as the biggest whale. And even if it's only a gas bag, it must still weigh 1,000,000 tons. I can't even guess at its metabolism." "But if it's just a gas bag, why is it such a damn good radar reflector?" "I haven't the faintest idea. Can you get any closer?" At the moment, he preferred his present 25 miles, and said so firmly. "I see what you mean," Brenner answered, a little reluctantly. "Let's stay where we are for the present." For the next 2 hours, Kon-Tiki drifted uneventfully in the eye of the whirlpool, Falcon constantly trying to get a clear view of the Medusa. Then, just before noon, without the slightest warning, the answer came. Like a squadron of antique jet fighters, 5 mantas came sweeping through the wall of mist. Flying in a V formation directly toward the pallid gray cloud of the Medusa. There was no doubt they were on the attack. He had been quite wrong to assume they were harmless vegetarians. Everything happened at such a leisurely pace. It was like watching a slow-motion film. When the mantas flapped down on the Medusa's back, huge as they were, they looked no larger than birds landing on a whale. But now it was obvious the Medusa was in distress, tipping over like a capsizing ship, rapidly losing altitude. It was impossible not to feel pity for the beleaguered monster. To Falcon, the sight brought bitter memories. In a grotesque way, the fall of the Medusa was almost a parody of the dying queen's last moments. Yet he knew his sympathies were on the wrong side. High intelligence could develop only among predators, not among the drifting browsers of either sea or air. Then the Medusa's tactics seemed to be having some effect. The mantas, disturbed by its slow roll, flapped heavily away from its back like gorged vultures interrupted at mealtime. There was a sudden blinding flash of light synchronized with a crash of static over the radio. One manta, twisting end over end, plummeted straight downward, a plume of black smoke trailing behind it. The resemblance to an aircraft going down in flames was uncanny. The remaining mantas dived steeply away and vanished into the wall of cloud. The Medusa, no longer falling, rolled back toward the horizontal and sailed on as if nothing had happened. "Beautiful," said Dr. Brenner, after a moment of stunned silence. "It's developed electric defenses like some of our eels and rays. That must have been about 1,000,000 volts. Can you see any organs that might produce the discharge?" "No," Falcon answered, switching to the highest power of the telescope. "But here's something odd. Do you see this pattern?" "Check back on the earlier images. I'm sure it wasn't there before." A broad, mottled band had appeared along the side of the Medusa, forming a startlingly regular checkerboard, each square speckled with short horizontal lines in a geometrically perfect array. "You're right," said Dr. Brenner, with something very much like awe. "Tots just appeared, and I'm afraid to tell you what I think it is. I have no reputation to lose, at least as a biologist. Shall I give my guess?" "Go ahead." That's a large meter-band radio array, the sort of thing they used back at the beginning of the 20th century. I was afraid you'd say that. Now we know why it gave such a massive echo. But why has it just appeared? Probably an after effect of the discharge. I've just had another thought, said Falcon. Do you suppose it's listening to us? On this frequency? I doubt it. Those are decameter antennas, judging by their size. That's an idea. I bet they're tuned to the radio outburst, something nature never got around to on Earth, where there was so much light. But it's different here. Jupiter is drenched with radio energy. That thing could be a floating power plant. A new voice cut in. Mission Commander here. This is all very interesting, but there's a more important matter to settle. Is it intelligent? If so, we've got to consider the first contact directives. Until I came here, said Dr. Brenner ruefully, I would have sworn that anything that could make a shortwave antenna system must be intelligent. Now I'm not sure. This could have evolved naturally, no more fantastic than the human eye. Then we have to play safe and assume intelligence. For the present, this expedition comes under all the clauses of the Prime Directive. There was a long silence while everyone absorbed the implications. For the first time in the history of spaceflight, rules established through more than a century of argument might have to be applied. Keep your distance. Make no attempt to approach or communicate until they have had plenty of time to study you. It was left to the discretion of the man on the spot. A responsibility of which he had never dreamed had descended upon Howard Falcon. In the few hours that remained to him on Jupiter, he might become the first ambassador of the human race. An irony so delicious that he almost wished the surgeons had restored to him the power of laughter. 7. Prime Directive. It was growing darker, but Falcon scarcely noticed as he strained his eyes toward that living cloud in the telescope. The wind sweeping Kon-Tiki around the whirlpool had now brought him within 12 miles of the creature. If he got much closer than 6, he would take evasive action. Now it was quite dark in the capsule, though sunset was still hours away. Suddenly, with startling power, he heard the sound that had come booming out of the Jovian night, the throbbing beat that grew more rapid, then stopped in mid-crescendo. The whole capsule vibrating with it like a pea in a kettle drum. This time it was not coming from thousands of miles away over a radio circuit. It was in the very atmosphere around him. And he had quite forgotten that most of the sky above him was completely blanked out by Kon-Tiki's gas bag, an effective shield both to radar and to vision. It seemed very important now, as he saw a fence of gigantic tentacles, thicker than the trunks of any tree, descending all around the capsule. He heard Brenner yelling, "Remember the Prime Directive. Don't alarm it." Before he could answer, the overwhelming drumbeat started again and drowned all other sounds. Falcon did not hesitate. In a lightning-swift movement, he pulled the ripcord. On Kon-Tiki, this merely operated a set of loops around the upper curve of the envelope. At once, the hot gas rushed out. Kon-Tiki, deprived of her lift, began to fall swiftly in this gravity field 2.5 times as strong as Earth's. Falcon had a momentary glimpse of great tentacles whipping upward and away, studded with large bladders, ending in thin feelers like the roots of a plant. He half expected a bolt of lightning, but nothing happened. His rate of descent slackened as the deflated envelope acted as a parachute. When Kon-Tiki had dropped about 2 miles, he closed the louvre again. By the time buoyancy was restored, he had lost another mile and was dangerously near his safety limit. He peered anxiously through the overhead windows. He had side-slipped during his descent, and part of the Medusa was visible a couple of miles above him, much closer than expected, still coming down. Mission Control was calling anxiously. He shouted, "I'm okay, but it's still coming after me. I can't go any deeper." Not quite true. He could go a lot deeper, but it would be a one-way trip. Then, to his great relief, the Medusa leveled off, not quite a mile above him, perhaps deciding to approach this strange intruder with caution, or finding this deeper layer uncomfortably hot itself. Over 50 degrees centigrade now, and Falcon wondered how much longer his life support system could handle matters. Dr. Brenner was back on the circuit, still worrying about the Prime Directive. "It may only be inquisitive," he cried without much conviction. "Try not to frighten it." Falcon was getting rather tired of this advice, and recalled a TV discussion between a space lawyer and an astronaut, who had exclaimed, "Then if there was no alternative, I must sit still and let myself be eaten?" The lawyer had not even cracked a smile. That's an excellent summing up. It had seemed funny at the time. It was not at all amusing now. The Medusa was still hovering about a mile above him, but one of its tentacles was becoming incredibly elongated, stretching down toward Kon-Tiki, thinning out as it came. Evoking memories of a tornado he had once seen as a boy, descending from a storm cloud over the Kansas plains. "I'm rapidly running out of options," he reported to Mission Control. "I now have only a choice between frightening it and giving it a bad stomachache. I don't think it will find Kon-Tiki very digestible." He waited for comments from Brenner, but the biologist remained silent. "Very well. It's ahead of schedule, but I'm starting the ignition sequencer. I hope I'll have enough reserve to correct my orbit later." He could no longer see the Medusa. It was directly overhead, but he knew the descending tentacle must now be very close to the balloon. It would take almost 5 minutes to bring the reactor up to full thrust. There had been no way of testing how a nuclear ramjet would really work in the strange atmosphere of Jupiter. Very gently, something rocked Kon-Tiki, a large, heavy hand patting the balloon, the whole vessel bobbing up and down like a yo-yo. The thin tip of the tentacle came slithering around the edge of the balloon some 60 yards away, about the size of an elephant's trunk, little palps at its end like questing mouths. This seemed about as good a time as any. He scanned the control board, started the final 4-second ignition count, broke the safety seal, and pressed the jettison switch. There was a sharp explosion and an instant loss of weight. Kon-Tiki was falling freely, nose down, the discarded balloon racing upward overhead, dragging the inquisitive tentacle with it. Falcon had no time to see the gas bag hit the Medusa, because at that moment the ramjet ignited. A roaring column of hot hydrohelium poured out of the reactor nozzles, building thrust, but toward Jupiter, not away from it. He could not pull out yet. Vector control too sluggish. Unless he gained complete control within the next 5 seconds, the vehicle would dive too deeply into the atmosphere and be destroyed. With agonizing slowness, he managed to flatten out, then pull the nose upward, glancing back once to catch a final glimpse of the Medusa, many miles away. Now he was master once more, no longer drifting helplessly on the winds of Jupiter, but riding his own column of atomic fire back to the stars. Halfway to orbit, he looked south and saw the tremendous enigma of the Great Red Spot, that floating island twice the size of Earth, coming up over the horizon. He stared into its mysterious beauty until the computer warned that conversion to rocket thrust was only 60 seconds ahead, and tore his gaze reluctantly away. "Some other time," he murmured. "What's that?" said Mission Control. "What did you say?" "It doesn't matter," he replied. 8. Between Two Worlds. "You're a hero now, Howard," said Webster. "Not just a celebrity. You've given them something to think about, injected excitement into their lives. Not one in a million will actually travel to the outer giants, but the whole human race will go in imagination, and that's what counts. I'm glad to have made your job a little easier." Webster was too old a friend to take offense at the note of irony. Yet it surprised him. This was not the first change in Howard that he had noticed since the return from Jupiter. The administrator pointed to the famous sign on his desk, borrowed from an impresario of an earlier age. "Astonish me. New knowledge, new resources, they're all very well. But men also need novelty and excitement. Space travel has become routine. You've made it a great adventure once more. It will be a long time before we get Jupiter pigeonholed, and maybe longer still before we understand those Medusae. Anyway, have you decided on your next move? Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, you name it." "I don't know. I've thought about Saturn, but I'm not really needed there. It's only one gravity, not 2.5 like Jupiter. So men can handle it." "Men," thought Webster. He said men. He's never done that before. And when did I last hear him use the word we? He's changing, slipping away from us. Well, hell," he said aloud, rising to conceal his slight uneasiness. "Let's get the conference started. The cameras are all set up and everyone's waiting. You'll meet a lot of old friends." He stressed the last word, but Howard showed no response. The leathery mask of his face was becoming more and more difficult to read. Instead, he rolled back from the desk, unlocked his undercarriage so that it no longer formed a chair, and rose on his hydraulics to his full 7 feet of height. It had been good psychology on the part of the surgeons to give him that extra 12 inches, to compensate somewhat for all he had lost when the Queen had crashed. Falcon waited until Webster had opened the door, then pivoted neatly on his balloon tires and headed for it at a smooth and silent 20 miles an hour. Howard Falcon, who had once been a man and could still pass for one over a voice circuit, felt a calm sense of achievement and, for the first time in years, something like peace of mind. Since his return from Jupiter, the nightmares had ceased. He had found his role. He now knew why he had dreamed about that superchimp aboard the doomed Queen Elizabeth. Neither man nor beast, it was between worlds, and so was he. He alone could travel unprotected on the lunar surface. The life support system inside the metal cylinder that had replaced his fragile body functioned equally well in space or underwater. Gravity fields 10 times that of Earth were an inconvenience, nothing more. And no gravity was best of all. The human race was becoming more remote, the ties of kinship tenuous. Perhaps these air-breathing, radiation-sensitive bundles of stable carbon comms had no right beyond the atmosphere. They should stick to their natural homes. Someday the real masters of space would be machines, not men. He was neither. Already conscious of his destiny, he took a somber pride in his unique loneliness, the first immortal midway between two orders of creation. He would, after all, be an ambassador between the old and the new, between the creatures of carbon and the creatures of metal who must one day supersede them. Both would have need of him in the troubled centuries that lay ahead.